The war had already stretched into its third relentless year when Lena Kovacs found herself still far from the thunder of the front lines. She had enlisted at the very start, full of conviction and with the fire of a soldier who believed her skills could make a difference, but instead of a rifle in her hands or a commanding post in a trench, she had been assigned to the role of medical support behind the lines. To many this was an honor in itself, for saving lives was no less important than taking them, but to Lena it felt like a cage. She had trained for years in sharpshooting competitions, her eye steady, her grip unflinching, and her scores higher than nearly every man who had once smirked at the sight of her stepping onto the range. Yet time and again her requests for reassignment were turned down. Commanders shook their heads, some with patronizing smiles, others with a simple refusal, insisting her value was in bandages and sutures, not in bullets and scopes. It was not that they doubted her skill, it was that she was a woman in a war that still clung to the rigid traditions of who belonged in the mud and who belonged behind the wire. She had grown used to the rhythm of treating soldiers who came back torn and bleeding. Each day meant the metallic stink of blood mixing with antiseptic, the screams of men who had been shattered by mortar fire, the dull groans of those who no longer had the strength to cry out. She held hands as the young slipped away, patched up those who could return to fight, and listened to stories told in fevered whispers by men who knew they would never again see the villages they came from. She became a ghost in white, moving from cot to cot, working without rest, her eyes carrying more exhaustion than sleep could ever heal. And yet behind that exhaustion burned frustration, a voice that whispered in her head each night as she cleaned the blood from her hands. I can do more than this. I was made for more than this. The chance to prove it came not in a way she expected but in the chaos of a day that seemed like any other. The camp lay just 10 miles behind the forward trenches, a cluster of tents spread out in a shallow valley where the sound of distant shellfire was a constant backdrop. That morning had been heavy with fog, the kind that clung low to the earth and blurred the line between ground and sky. Lena had been restocking medical supplies, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back, when the sudden crack of gunfire cut through the fog. Shouts followed, not the panicked cries of wounded men but the sharp, frantic commands of officers. She ran out from the supply tent, instinct driving her toward the noise, and what she saw froze her breath. A squadron of enemy infiltrators had slipped past the forward defenses under cover of the fog and were descending on the camp with ruthless precision. They carried silenced rifles and grenades, their target not the soldiers resting but the stockpiles of ammunition and medical stores. Panic spread as men scrambled for weapons, some half-dressed, others still dazed from sleep. Lena's heart pounded as she ducked behind a sandbag wall, her hands trembling, not from fear but from the sudden surge of clarity. This was no longer about waiting for someone to give her permission. This was about survival, about protecting the men who had trusted her to stitch them back together, about stopping the destruction that would cost countless lives if the supplies fell into enemy hands. Her eyes darted across the chaos until they landed on a rifle lying in the dirt, dropped by a fallen soldier. She didn't think, she simply moved, sprinting low, her boots splashing through mud as bullets cracked past her ears. She slid beside the body, whispered an apology she did not have time to speak aloud, and snatched the weapon. It felt heavier than the one she had trained with back home, but the weight was familiar, the balance natural in her grip. She checked the chamber, drew in a breath, and raised the scope to her eye. The fog still clung to the camp, silhouettes shifting in and out like ghosts, but Lena's world narrowed to the circle of glass before her. Her heart slowed, her breathing steadied, and all at once she was no longer a nurse scrambling through panic. She was a shooter, every muscle aligning with purpose. The first shot rang out sharp and true, cutting through the fog with a crack that echoed in her bones. One of the infiltrators dropped instantly, his weapon clattering against the dirt. Another turned in surprise, and before he could raise his rifle, Lena's second shot found him. Soldiers around her shouted in confusion, some ducking, others staring wide-eyed at the nurse who now moved with the deadly calm of a veteran marksman. She did not hear them. Her mind was focused only on the shapes moving against the white haze, each one a threat, each one a calculation of distance, wind, and timing. 3 fell, then 4, and with each shot the tide began to turn. Her comrades rallied, emboldened by the sudden invisible guardian who struck down enemies from the mist. What they didn't know was that Lena was not shooting blindly. She saw everything, the way a shadow shifted before emerging into light, the faint glint of a rifle barrel through the fog, the split-second hesitation of a man about to move. She picked them off one by one, conserving her ammunition, never wasting a bullet. Then came the moment that would later be spoken of in hushed awe, the moment that carried the weight of 50 lives. Through her scope she spotted him. The enemy commander crouched behind a crate, a grenade primed in his hand, his gaze fixed on the tent where the wounded lay. If he made it, if that grenade rolled into the heart of the medical ward, the men too weak to crawl away would be slaughtered, and the supplies that kept hundreds alive would vanish in flame. The fog swirled, obscuring her vision, but she knew she had no time to wait. She inhaled, felt the cold press of the trigger beneath her finger, and let instinct take control. The rifle cracked, the fog seemed to split, and in that single breath of silence the commander fell, the grenade slipping harmlessly from his hand. The explosion echoed away from the tents, harmless to those inside. 50 lives, maybe more, saved by one shot. The battle in the camp raged for another 10 minutes, but the infiltrators' momentum had been shattered. With their leader gone and their numbers dwindling, they faltered under the counterattack of soldiers now fully awake and fully armed. By the time the fog began to lift, the camp was scarred with smoke and blood, but it still stood. And at the heart of it, kneeling with the rifle clutched in her hands, Lena Kovacs finally felt the strange mixture of exhaustion and triumph she had long imagined. She had been kept from the front lines, denied her chance to prove herself, but in a single hour she had changed the fate of an entire company. She did not know what the officers would say, or whether she would be punished for taking up a weapon not assigned to her, but she knew this. When the story of that day spread, no one would ever again look at her and see only a nurse. They would see the woman who, with one shot, saved 50 lives. That night the camp was eerily quiet, as if even the usual moans of the wounded and the murmurs of men dreaming of home had been silenced by what had transpired. The fog had lifted, leaving behind a damp chill that clung to Lena's skin, but she hardly noticed it. Her body was stiff from the hours of tension, her hands still faintly trembling though. She had scrubbed them clean a dozen times. The rifle had been taken from her after the attack, and though she handed it over without protest, she felt the absence of its weight like a missing limb. She had returned to the medical tent out of instinct, but her eyes kept drifting back to the entrance, half expecting the officers to storm in and demand answers. Yet no one came for her that night, and so she worked as she always did, stitching wounds, checking bandages, offering water to parched lips, even as every soldier who caught her gaze looked at her differently than before. There was no pity in their eyes now, no dismissal, no assumption that she belonged behind them rather than beside them. There was respect, the kind born not of words or rank but of action that had saved their lives. By morning the rumors had already begun. Soldiers whispered in corners, their voices hushed but their excitement barely contained, telling and retelling the story of the nurse who had picked up a rifle and shot through the fog like she had been born with a scope in her eye. Some claimed she had dropped 10 men single-handedly, others swore it was 20, though Lena herself knew the truth, that her bullets had found 6, perhaps 7, and that only one of those shots truly mattered. But the details blurred in the retelling, becoming legend faster than she could stop it. She overheard them as she moved between patients, some speaking her name with awe, others with disbelief, but all of them carried the same unshakable certainty. She had turned the battle in their favor, and without her they would have lost far more than supplies. It did not take long for the officers to summon her. She entered the command tent with her head held high, her uniform neat despite the stains that never seemed to wash away. Around the table sat men hardened by years of war, their maps spread out before them like sacred texts, their faces etched with lines of exhaustion and doubt. The commanding officer, Colonel Varga, regarded her with an expression she could not read, somewhere between stern disapproval and cautious admiration. "Nurse Kovacs," he began, his voice low and gravelly, "it seems last night you decided to take up arms." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint tapping of a pencil against the map. Lena did not flinch. "Sir, the camp was under attack. Our men were unprepared. I did what I had to do." Varga studied her a moment longer before leaning back in his chair. "What you did saved this camp. No one denies that. But you acted without orders. You crossed a line we have kept in place for a reason." Another officer, younger and sharper, leaned forward with a frown. "A nurse is not a sniper. She belongs in the ward, not on the battlefield." The words stung, though she had heard them 100 times before. But before she could respond, another voice, weary yet firm, spoke from the far end of the table. "With respect, gentlemen, if she had not crossed that line, we would be burying dozens today. Perhaps ourselves included." All eyes turned to Major Holtz, a grizzled veteran whose arm lay in a sling from a wound weeks earlier. His gaze rested on Lena, and in it she saw not just gratitude but recognition. The debate dragged on for hours, the officers divided between tradition and necessity, between rules written in manuals and the harsh truth of survival. Lena stood silently through it, her jaw tight, her heart pounding with each dismissive remark and each voice raised in her defense. Finally, Varga raised a hand, silencing the tent. Enough. The matter is settled. Kovacs will remain in her post as a nurse. But if such a moment arises again, and she is the only one standing between our men and death, then she will act. No commendation, no punishment. The war decides who we become, not us. His words carried the weight of compromise, yet Lena could see in his eyes that he too understood what she had done could not be erased, nor contained by the simple boundaries of rank. When she left the tent, the air felt sharper, colder, as though the camp itself had shifted overnight. Men saluted her now, some clapping her shoulder, others simply meeting her gaze with silent nods of acknowledgement. She tried to brush it off to return to her cots and bandages, but the whispers followed her like shadows. "That's her," they said. "The one who saved us." And though she told herself not to care, not to let pride seep into her bones, a part of her couldn't help but feel a flicker of vindication. She had been told she was meant only to heal, never to fight, and yet she had proven with her own hands that she could do both. But victory, even small, carried its own burden. That night, as the soldiers gathered around fires and spoke in hushed tones, Lena sat alone, staring at her blood-stained hands. She thought of the faces of the men she had killed, shadows glimpsed through fog, bodies dropping into silence. She told herself they would have killed her comrades, that they had come with the intent to slaughter, but the memory of her finger tightening on the trigger lingered. She had saved lives, yes, but she had also taken them, and no amount of justification erased that truth. Sleep came fitfully, broken by flashes of fog and the echo of gunfire, each dream ending with the face of the enemy commander staring at her through the scope, his eyes wide in that final instant before her bullet ended him. The following weeks tested her resolve in ways she had not imagined. Patrols grew more frequent, ambushes more daring, and the enemy seemed determined to strike at the camp again. Each time an alarm was raised, Lena felt the same urge rise within her, the same instinct to reach for a rifle instead of a bandage. But the rifles were no longer given to her. They were locked away, kept out of reach as if the officers feared what might happen if she touched one again. She obeyed, outwardly calm, but inside the fire only grew stronger. Her comrades now looked to her in moments of fear, their trust implicit, as though her presence alone was enough to ward off danger. Yet she knew trust alone would not stop bullets. And then came the day when everything changed again. It was during an evacuation of the forward trenches, the air thick with smoke and the earth trembling under the relentless pounding of artillery. Lena had been ordered to help load the wounded onto trucks bound for safer ground, her hands working swiftly to lift, carry, secure. She was halfway through when she heard it, a sharp crack from the hills above, the unmistakable report of a sniper. A soldier beside her dropped instantly, blood pooling at her feet, and panic surged through the men as they scrambled for cover. The sniper had them pinned, each shot precise, merciless, cutting down anyone who dared move into the open. The trucks could not leave, the wounded were trapped, exposed to death one by one. Lena felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew what had to be done. And though the rifles were locked away in camp, fate had once again placed one within her reach. The fallen soldier's weapon lay at her feet, his blood seeping into the dirt beside it. Her fingers closed around the stock before she even realized she had moved. She dropped to the ground, pressed her cheek to the wood and lifted her eyes to the scope. Through it she saw the glint of glass on the ridge, the faint outline of the sniper concealed among rocks. Time seemed to stretch, her heart slowing, her breath steadying as the chaos around her faded into silence. Was only her, the scope, and the target who had pinned down dozens of men. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and in that moment she knew she was no longer just a nurse who had once taken up a rifle. She was something more, something the war had made her become, whether the officers liked it or not. The recoil of the rifle pressed hard into her shoulder, but Lena hardly noticed it, for the sound of the shot blended seamlessly into the ringing silence that followed. Through the scope she saw the enemy sniper's head snap back, his rifle clattering against the rocks as his body went limp and rolled down the slope. For a moment she did not breathe, waiting, watching, half expecting another shot to echo back in reply. But none came. The silence stretched, broken only by the cries of wounded men and the nervous shouts of soldiers peeking from behind cover. Slowly they realized what had happened, that the single shot had ended the threat that had pinned them down. Relief rippled through the group like a sudden gust of wind, men rising to their feet, rushing to continue the evacuation. Trucks roared to life, tires grinding through the mud, carrying away the injured who moments before had been trapped. Lena lowered the rifle and sat back on her heels, her hands trembling though her aim had been steady. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her again, a mixture of grim satisfaction and gnawing guilt. She had saved them, there was no denying that, but she had also crossed that invisible line once more, the one her commanders insisted she stay behind. Around her, soldiers moved quickly, shouting orders, carrying stretchers, loading crates, yet their eyes flickered toward her with that same look she was beginning to recognize: awe, respect, even a touch of fear. No one spoke to her directly, not yet, but she could feel their unspoken words lingering in the air. She was no longer just Lena the nurse. She was the woman who had dropped a sniper from the ridge with a single shot. By the time the convoy returned to camp, the news had already spread. Word traveled faster than trucks, carried on whispers and half-shouted tales that grew in scale with each retelling. Some said she had faced down 3 snipers and killed them all. Others claimed she had marched up the ridge alone and taken the enemy's nest by herself. Lena did not correct them, for what was the use? The truth was enough for her, even if legends had a way of painting her into something larger than she felt she was. What mattered was that the wounded had survived, that the trucks had returned with far more living than dead. Still, she braced herself as she stepped back into the medical tent, knowing it was only a matter of time before the officers summoned her again. This time the summons came before nightfall. She was led once more to the command tent, where Colonel Vargas sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone. The officers beside him were restless, their faces tight with a mixture of unease and begrudging admiration. "Kovacs," Vargas said, his voice low but firm, "we told you once before that your duty is here in the ward. And yet here we are again. Another weapon in your hands. Another shot that changed the battle." Lena stood straight, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Sir, if I hadn't acted, more would have died. I couldn't stand by while they were slaughtered." Her voice carried no tremor, only the quiet certainty of someone who knew the truth of her actions. The younger officer who had objected before slammed his palm on the table. "This is reckless. We cannot allow soldiers to break protocol whenever they feel like it. If every nurse picked up a rifle, we'd have chaos." But once again Major Holtz, still bearing his sling, leaned forward. "If every nurse could shoot like her, we'd have fewer funerals." His words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Silence followed, broken only by the scratch of Vargas' pencil against the map. Finally the colonel sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of inevitability. "Perhaps the war has already decided for us," he said. His gaze shifted back to Lena. "You will remain in your duties as a nurse. But when the situation demands it, when there is no one else, you will take the shot. Unofficial, unrecorded, but understood. Do you accept this burden?" Lena's throat tightened, not with fear but with the gravity of what he was asking. She was being given no title, no recognition, only permission to act in the shadows of necessity. Yet that was enough. She nodded once. "I accept." For a moment Vargas studied her as though trying to see the soldier beneath the nurse, the marksman hidden beneath the healer. Then he dismissed her with a wave, his voice quieter now. "Pray the war does not demand too much of you." The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of blood and gunfire, healing and killing, life and death. Lena became 2 people at once, her hands stitching torn flesh by day, her eye pressed to a scope by night when the alarms rang and the camp shook with enemy fire. Each time she lifted a rifle, she felt the same calm clarity settle over her, the world narrowing to the circle of the scope, her pulse steady as she squeezed the trigger. Each time she returned to her tent, she felt the same shadow of guilt creep in, the weight of the faces she would never forget. Yet the soldiers no longer whispered, they spoke openly of her now, some calling her guardian, others angel, still others sharpshooter. She did not correct them. She simply kept working, knowing the war cared little for names. It was during one of the fiercest assaults yet that Lena's dual life was laid bare in all its harsh truth. The enemy struck under cover of darkness, artillery pounding the camp until the ground shook and tents collapsed like paper. Men scrambled in chaos, cries of the wounded mixing with the thunder of shells. Lena had been in the medical ward when the first explosions hit, the canvas above her head ripping apart as fire rained down. She dragged men from the rubble, her arms burning with effort, her lungs choking on smoke, until she heard it, the sharp crack of rifles in the distance, the telltale sign of marksmen targeting anyone who tried to move supplies or drag the wounded to safety. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest rifle and sprinted out into the night, ducking behind a collapsed cart. Through the smoke and flame she saw them, 3 silhouettes on the ridge, their rifles flashing as they picked off her comrades. She steadied her breath, her mind slipping into that familiar focus. The first shot dropped one, the second tore through another before he could reload, and the third, Oh, the third lingered in her mind long after, for she had to wait, heart-pounding, until the last sniper turned his scope toward the very tent she had just pulled men from. Her bullet reached him first, and in that moment she knew she had once again shifted the tide. But when she lowered the rifle, she realized she was no longer alone. A group of soldiers had watched her from behind a wall of sandbags, their eyes wide, their mouths open. They had seen her, not just a fleeting rumor, not just whispers of what she might have done. They had seen her shoot, seen her kill, seen her save them with their own eyes. And in that moment something changed. The legend was no longer a tale told in hushed tones, it was truth, undeniable, witnessed. Later, when the fires were out and the wounded lay tended, the soldiers approached her one by one. Some offered thanks, others simply nodded, but all of them carried the same unshakable respect. She was no longer just part of the camp. She was part of their survival, woven into their faith that they might live another day. And though the officers still said nothing, though no commendation came, Lena knew the truth. She had become a weapon the war had forged in secret, hidden behind bandages and syringes until the moment necessity revealed her. She did not ask for it, she did not crave it, but it was hers now, as much a part of her as the hands that healed. And in the quiet that followed, when the stars finally emerged from behind the smoke, Lena sat alone with the rifle across her knees. She traced its cold steel with her fingers and whispered into the night, not to herself, not to the war, but to the men she had saved and the ones she had taken. "I will not waste a single shot," she said softly. "Not one." The war did not wait for anyone, not even for legends, and Lena learned quickly that the price of her actions was not measured only in whispers of respect but in the heaviness that settled deeper on her shoulders with each passing day. She moved like a ghost through the camp now, her presence a quiet reassurance to those around her, though she spoke little of what she had done or what she might be called to do again. By day she was still the nurse, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she stitched wounds, scrubbed blood from her hands, and whispered words of comfort to men who clung to life with the desperation of drowning sailors. By night, when the distant crack of rifles echoed through the hills or alarms tore through the darkness, she became something else entirely, sliding into position with a rifle, her eyes narrowing through the scope, her breathing steady as she delivered death with the same precision she delivered healing. But it was never simple, never clean. The weight of each shot lingered with her long after the battlefield had quieted. She remembered the faces of those she saved, the grateful smiles of soldiers who could carry on because of her, but she also remembered the fleeting glimpses of the men she felled, the widening of eyes, the slackening of jaws, the human shock of life ending in an instant. She told herself over and over that it was necessary, that every enemy she cut down was one less soldier who would butcher her comrades, one less shadow stalking the wounded. Still, the memories came to her at night, her dreams filled with the endless repetition of scopes and faces, bullets leaving her barrel and never stopping. Her reputation reached beyond the camp before long. Convoys arriving from other divisions carried stories of the mysterious nurse who could stitch a wound by morning and take out a sniper by night. Some thought she was a fabrication, a tale spun to give men hope. Others believed she was an angel, vengeance incarnate sent to protect them. Lena never acknowledged any of it, but she noticed the way visiting officers watched her longer than others, their gazes sharp with suspicion or curiosity. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone higher up demanded answers, before her role in this war was questioned not by those whose lives she saved but by men who lived by rules written far from the battlefield. The moment came sooner than she expected. One evening as she scrubbed her hands raw at the basin, a jeep arrived at camp, bearing the insignia of the high command. From it stepped a man whose uniform was immaculate, whose medals glittered faintly even in the fading light. General Karsten, a name whispered with both reverence and fear, had come in person. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without hesitation, his eyes sharp as blades as they scanned the camp. When they settled on Lena, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had been summoned before colonels and majors, but this was different. This was the war itself looking at her, calculating her worth. That night she was brought to the largest tent, where maps covered the tables and lanterns flickered shadows against canvas walls. Karsten stood at the center, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice cold as he addressed her. "Nurse Kovacs," he said, the title carrying an edge that made it sound almost like an accusation. "I have heard unusual reports about you. Reports that suggest you are not content with your duties, that you have taken up arms, that you have, on more than one occasion, turned the tide of battle." His words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and dangerous. Lena straightened, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Sir, I did only what was necessary. The camp was under attack. Men would have died if I hadn't acted. Karsten's eyes narrowed. And yet you acted. Without orders. Without permission. You killed. Do you understand what that means? She hesitated, then answered simply, it means they lived. For the first time, something flickered in Karsten's gaze, not approval, not admiration, but the faintest glimmer of recognition. He studied her in silence, the weight of his judgment pressing down on her until she felt she might break. Then at last he spoke again. War bends rules. Sometimes it breaks them. Perhaps you are proof of that. Perhaps you are proof of something else entirely. You will continue as you have been. But make no mistake, every shot you take ties you to this war in ways you cannot undo. Remember that when you sleep, if you can. She left the tent with her heart pounding, her mind heavy with the knowledge that her actions were no longer invisible, no longer hidden in the fog of battle. She was watched now, not only by the men she saved but by the eyes of command, eyes that would weigh her usefulness against her defiance. And yet, deep inside, she felt a strange calm. She had not sought this path, but it had found her, and she could not turn away. Too many depended on her. Too many lived because of her. The next days brought no respite. The enemy, emboldened by their relentless offensives, launched a series of attacks meant to break the spirit of those holding the line. Shells rained down on trenches, convoys were ambushed, and the wounded poured into Lena's tent until the cots overflowed and the ground itself became a makeshift ward. She worked until her fingers bled, her back bent under the strain, but even exhaustion could not dull the instinct that surged whenever danger crept close. One night, as fire lit the horizon and tracer rounds carved the sky, she found herself once more with a rifle in hand, her body moving before her mind could question it. Through the smoke she saw them, 3 enemy soldiers creeping toward the supply trucks, grenades strapped to their belts. Her comrades were too far, too busy fighting off the main assault. It was her choice, her burden, and so she made it. 3 shots, 3 bodies crumpled in the dirt, and the supplies remained untouched. She exhaled, her body trembling as the weight settled again, but there was no time to linger. She returned to the tents, blood smearing her hands as she worked to save those who had not yet slipped away. As dawn broke, she caught her reflection in a shard of broken glass, and for the first time she did not recognize the woman staring back at her. Her eyes were hard now, lined with shadows, her jaw set in a way that spoke of choices made too often and too heavy. She was still Lena Kovacs, the nurse, but she was also something else, something the war had created from necessity and despair. She wondered if there would be a place for her when the guns finally fell silent, if the world beyond battlefields could ever understand what she had become. But then she pushed the thought aside, for another soldier groaned in pain and another set of hands reached for her help. The war had no patience for questions, only for answers written in blood and sacrifice. And Lena, whether she liked it or not, had become one of those answers. She would keep saving lives, she would keep taking them, and she would keep walking the narrow line between healer and killer until the war decided it was finished with her. Until then, she whispered to herself as she bound another wound, she would not falter. Not while men still breathed because of her. Not while she still had bullets left to fire. Weeks turned into months and the war showed no signs of slowing. Each sunrise brought fresh smoke on the horizon. Each night carried the echo of distant gunfire like thunder that never truly ended. Lena moved between 2 worlds now, the sterile harshness of the medical tents and the merciless clarity of the battlefield. Soldiers no longer questioned her presence with a rifle when the situation demanded it. They did not ask for orders, they did not wait for explanations. When a shot rang out from the ridges and an enemy fell, they only glanced at her with a mixture of gratitude and reverence. Yet for all the respect, Lena carried no pride, only the constant ache of knowing she had walked too far down a path from which there was no return. Her reputation spread beyond the division, carried in fragments of stories told around campfires or written in hurried letters home. Some painted her as a guardian spirit, others as a grim avenger, but the truth was simpler and heavier. She was a woman doing what the war forced her to do. When supply trucks rolled into camp from other sectors, soldiers she had never met would salute her, whispering her name like it was a charm against death. Lena felt the weight of their expectations pressing harder than the rifle she carried. They believed in her, not just as a nurse or a comrade, but as a figure larger than life, someone who could stand against the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. And in quiet moments she feared she would fail them, that one day her shot would miss, and the legend would crumble into dust. It was during the bitter winter months that her resolve was tested most fiercely. Snow fell in relentless sheets, coating the trenches in ice, turning mud into frozen stone. The wounded came in shivering, their breath misting in the cold, their wounds slower to heal in the biting air. Lena worked with numb fingers, her hands raw and cracked, yet she never stopped. Supplies ran thin, bandages frozen stiff, morphine stretched to drops, but she did what she could, improvising, comforting, fighting to hold back death even as it pressed closer with each day. And still the war gave her no peace. One night, under the pale glow of the moon on the snow, the enemy struck again. They came not in scattered infiltrations but in a coordinated push, determined to overrun the camp entirely. Artillery shattered the silence, shells exploding in bursts of fire that sent snow and earth raining down. Men scrambled from their tents, rifles shaking in frozen hands, as waves of enemy soldiers surged from the darkness. Lena was in the ward, already pulling the wounded toward cover, when she heard the cries that chilled her blood. Enemy troops had broken through on the east side, rushing toward the medical tents, bayonets glinting in the moonlight. For the first time, it was not supplies they sought, but the very men too weak to stand easy prey for their blades. She did not hesitate. A fallen soldier's rifle lay against the cot, and she seized it, the cold metal biting into her palms. She knelt by the tent's entrance, steadying her breath as the shapes closed in. Her world narrowed to the scope, the crosshairs finding one figure then another. Each shot cracked through the night, echoing against the snow, each body falling before it could reach the tent. Soldiers inside stared wide-eyed, unable to believe what they saw. A nurse crouched in blood-stained uniform, her face set in grim determination as she held back the enemy alone. Yet Lena did not think of herself or of what they might say tomorrow. She thought only of the men behind her, helpless, depending on her aim. 5 fell, then 6, and still they came. She felt the barrel grow hot against the freezing air, her shoulder bruised with each recoil, but she did not waver. When her rifle finally clicked empty, she dropped it and grabbed another from the ground, continuing without pause. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, the battlefield a blur of smoke, snow, and fire. By the time reinforcements pushed the enemy back, the entrance to the ward was littered with bodies, the snow stained crimson around her boots. She lowered the rifle, her chest heaving, her fingers raw from the cold, and only then realized she was crying silently, tears freezing on her cheeks. The men she had protected looked at her with something beyond gratitude now. It was worship, the kind reserved not for mortals but for myths. Some whispered prayers in her direction, others kissed small charms or tokens, as if her presence alone had blessed them. Lena turned away, her heart heavy. She had saved them, yes, but she wondered how many more she would have to kill before the war allowed her to rest. That night, when the fires died down and silence returned, she sat alone in the snow, staring at the stars with the rifle across her knees. The sky above seemed endless, indifferent, and she felt smaller than ever beneath it. Days later, General Karsten returned, his jeep carving fresh tracks into the frozen earth. He did not summon her immediately, but Lena knew why he had come. Her actions were no longer whispers. They were reports, documented and undeniable. When she finally stood before him in the command tent, his expression was unreadable, though his eyes betrayed the weight of decision. "You have forced our hand," he said coldly. "Your deeds cannot be ignored. The men believe in you. They would follow you into fire if asked. That kind of power is dangerous if left unshaped." He paused, studying her as if trying to see the balance between the healer and the killer. "From this day forward you will remain both. Nurse and marksman. Officially sanctioned, though your name will never reach the records. You will be our secret, our shadow, the one who saves quietly where others cannot." Lena felt her chest tighten at his words. It was recognition, yes, but also condemnation. She would never be celebrated, never be remembered in history books. Her victories would be swallowed by silence, her burdens carried alone. And yet, as she thought of the men who had lived because she had acted, she knew she could not refuse. She nodded once, her voice steady. "I'll do what I must." Karsten regarded her for a long moment, then finally turned away. "Pray the war spares your soul, Kovacs. For when it ends, you may find you have nothing left of it." She left the tent that night with the weight of his words pressing down on her, heavier than any rifle she had ever carried. The camp greeted her with silent respect, soldiers stepping aside, their eyes following her with a reverence she could neither accept nor deny. She returned to her work, binding wounds, soothing pain, her hands as gentle as they had always been. But deep inside she knew something had shifted. She was no longer only a nurse, no longer only a marksman. She was both, bound together by the war that demanded everything from her. And though she feared what that meant for the woman she had once been, she also knew there was no turning back. As she lay down to rest, exhaustion dragging her eyes closed, she whispered into the cold air, not a prayer, not a plea but a vow. If this is who I must be, then so be it. I will not waste what I've been given. I will not let them fall while I still stand. And somewhere in the distance, as if in answer, a single shot cracked through the night, reminding her that the war was far from over, and her story far from finished. Winter eventually loosened its grip, but the war did not. As the snow melted into rivers of mud, new offensives began, each one more desperate than the last. Lena found herself moving further from the rear tents and closer to the lines than she had ever imagined, pulled there by the orders of commanders who now saw her as indispensable. When casualties surged beyond the capacity of the medics, she was there to stabilize the wounded, her hands swift and steady. When enemy scouts threatened their positions, she was sent high into the ridges with her rifle, her sharp eye scanning for the glint of steel or the shift of movement. She lived in two realities at once, one of blood and bandages and one of crosshairs and death. And each night, when she returned to camp, she wondered which side of herself had carried her further through the day. The soldiers around her had begun to change in her presence. They no longer viewed her as someone fragile, someone who needed protection from the brutality of the front. Instead, they gathered strength from her composure, looking to her as a quiet anchor amid chaos. Men broken by fear would sit beside her at night, speaking in low voices about their homes, their wives, their children. She listened, offering few words, but her silence was never empty. It was steady, reassuring, a reminder that she was still there, still enduring alongside them. And though she carried the weight of all she had seen, she never let them glimpse how deep the scars ran inside her. It was in early spring that the division received its most dangerous orders yet, to hold a narrow pass through the mountains, a passage vital for supply lines. If the enemy seized it, entire regiments would starve or fall cut off. The terrain was treacherous, the cliffs towering on either side like walls, the air thin and sharp. Every soldier knew the battle there would be merciless, but none questioned their orders. They dug in, setting up makeshift defenses, their faces drawn but determined. Lena was ordered to stay near the rear, tending to the wounded as they came, but she already knew she would not be able to remain there when the fighting began. The pass was too exposed, the lines too fragile. If her rifle could make a difference, she would use it. The attack came at dawn. The enemy descended from the ridges like shadows, their figures stark against the rising sun. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the stone walls, the sound magnified until it seemed to shake the earth itself. Lena rushed between the wounded, dragging them to cover, pressing bandages against wounds that poured through her fingers faster than she could stop. But when the first wave nearly broke through, she seized her rifle and scrambled up the slope, finding a perch among the rocks. From there, she could see everything, the twisting path of the pass, the desperate line of her comrades below, the endless tide pressing against them. She steadied her breath, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of her aim, and began to fire. Each shot was deliberate, precise, cutting down officers who signaled the advance, machine gunners who tore through the ranks, scouts who tried to flank the defenses. Every second she bought them meant another wounded soldier carried back, another line held a little longer. Yet she felt no triumph. With each pull of the trigger, she felt the humanity of her target slip through her grasp, leaving behind only necessity. She whispered to herself between shots, not prayers but reminders, for them, for the wounded, for those who cannot fight. It was the only way to keep the weight from crushing her. The battle raged for hours, and as the sun climbed high, the air filled with smoke and dust. Enemy artillery began to hammer the cliffs, shaking rocks loose from above. Lena pressed herself into the stone, the shock waves rattling her bones, but she did not stop. Below, soldiers glanced up toward her perch, their hope renewed each time her rifle cracked and an enemy fell. She became the unseen shield, holding the pass as much with her will as with her weapon. And when the tide finally began to falter, when the enemy broke and retreated back into the mountains, Lena lowered her rifle, her arms trembling from exhaustion. The ground below was a graveyard of bodies and shattered earth. Her comrades moved among the fallen, gathering the living, whispering names of the dead. Lena climbed down slowly, her boots slipping on loose stone, her entire body aching. When she reached the bottom, the men greeted her not with cheers but with silence, the kind of silence reserved for the sacred. One soldier, his arm in a sling, stepped forward and simply placed a hand over his heart before bowing his head. Others followed, not in unison but one by one, until the weight of their gesture left her unable to speak. She nodded once, swallowing the knot in her throat, and returned to her work, cleaning wounds, stitching torn flesh, her hands moving automatically while her mind drifted far away. That night, by the dim glow of a lantern, she sat with her back against the cold stone wall of the pass, her rifle across her knees. She felt both pride and grief tangled in her chest, an impossible knot she could not undo. She thought of the faces she had seen through her scope, the lives she had ended to save others. She thought of the soldiers who would live because of her, men who would one day return home to their families. And she thought of herself, wondering if she would ever return home whole, or if the war had already claimed too much of her. Word spread quickly of her role in holding the pass. Even generals in distant sectors heard of the nurse who had fought like a marksman and saved an entire division from collapse. Some wanted to bring her forward for recognition, to use her as a symbol of resilience, but the decision from above remained the same. Lena Kovacs would remain a shadow, her name absent from records, her deeds buried beneath official reports. She would be honored only in the hearts of those she saved and nowhere else. At first, the thought stung deeply, the idea that she would vanish from history as if she had never existed. But as she looked around at the men sleeping soundly for the first time in weeks, she realized that perhaps this was enough. Still, in her quiet moments, doubts lingered. She felt the tremors in her hands when she washed them clean of blood, the heaviness in her chest when she lay down to rest. She wondered if she could carry on much longer without breaking apart. And yet, when the next dawn came, when the bugle called and the war demanded more, she rose again, her uniform patched and stained, her rifle slung over her back. She did not think of glory or recognition. She thought only of the next life she might save, the next wound she might mend, the next soldier she might protect. And though the war had stolen so much from her, it had given her one unshakable truth. She would not stop, not while she still had breath to fight and hands to heal. The weeks after the Battle of the Pass blurred together into a rhythm of exhaustion and necessity. Lena barely noticed the changing seasons anymore, only the endless cycle of dawns that began with gunfire and nights that ended with her hands stained in blood. Sleep was something stolen in fragments, never long enough to dream, never deep enough to forget. She kept moving because stopping meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, and she could not afford that anymore. To the men, she was still a source of strength, a presence they leaned on when despair threatened to crush them. But inside, she was growing hollow, like a candle burning lower with each hour, its flame steady but shrinking all the same. The commanders had begun to treat her as an essential part of their strategy. Whenever they planned an operation in a vulnerable area, she was included, not as a soldier in rank but as a shadow in practice. They positioned her where she could do the most damage with her rifle and then expected her to return to her tent and work miracles with her medical skills. She no longer questioned it. Orders came, she obeyed. The line between her two selves, healer and sniper, blurred so completely that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. There were nights when she washed her hands in the basin, red water swirling down the drain, and for a moment she could not remember whether the blood had come from saving a life or taking one. It was during one of these long gray days that the war tested her in ways it never had before. A major offensive was launched, the kind of campaign whispered about for weeks beforehand, when everyone knew that losses would be catastrophic no matter the outcome. Their division was ordered to seize a fortified hill that dominated the surrounding valley. The hill was a graveyard already, its slopes riddled with trenches, its summit crowned with artillery that spat fire into the valley below. Dozens had tried to take it before and failed, leaving behind bodies that lay frozen in the mud. Yet the order stood: seize it or lose the valley entirely. The morning of the assault was cloaked in mist, the kind that dampened sound and blurred shapes into shadows. Lena moved with the medics, her pack heavy with bandages, morphine and tools. She told herself she would stay with the wounded, that she would not climb that hill with the others. But when the artillery began and the first wave surged forward into the fog, her resolve wavered. She could hear the screams already, the cries for help mingling with the thunder of shells, and she knew she would not remain in the rear. Without thinking, she picked up a rifle from a fallen soldier and pressed on into the smoke. The hill was a nightmare of mud and fire. Mortars exploded in fountains of earth, bullets whistled so close they tore fabric from her sleeve, and the ground was slick with the bodies of the fallen. Lena dropped beside one soldier, binding his leg while enemy fire stitched the ground inches away. She dragged another into a crater, pressing morphine into his arm, whispering reassurance even as he bled out beneath her hands. But every time she saved one, another fell and another after that. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and iron, and the cries never stopped. When she saw the line beginning to falter, when she saw enemy gunners pinning her comrades against the rocks, she raised her rifle without hesitation. The world shrank to the scope again, her breath slow, her body steady. She picked off the gunners one by one, her shots precise even through the swirling mist. Soldiers glanced back, renewed by her unseen hand, and pushed forward once more. Lena moved with them, firing, reloading, then dropping beside the fallen to tear strips of cloth and press them into wounds. She was everywhere at once, a ghost on the battlefield, a guardian and an avenger, and still the hill refused to yield. Hours stretched into an eternity. By midday the mist had burned away, revealing the full horror of the slope. Hundreds dead, trenches soaked with blood, artillery still pounding from above. Lena's arms shook from the weight of the rifle, her pack nearly empty of supplies. She stumbled from one wounded man to the next, her knees buckling as exhaustion gnawed at her, yet she did not stop. Then, as the enemy mounted a counterattack pouring down the slope in waves, she felt something inside her snap. For the first time since the war began, she was certain they would all die there, crushed against the hill that swallowed men whole. And then came the moment that would haunt her forever. A group of enemy soldiers broke through near her position, rushing toward a cluster of her comrades who were too wounded to move. Lena swung her rifle up, her hands shaking, her vision blurred from smoke and tears. She fired once, twice, 3 times, each shot finding its mark. But one figure broke through the chaos, sprinting toward the wounded with a bayonet raised. She steadied her rifle and fired, and when the body crumpled to the ground, the helmet rolled away to reveal not the face of a hardened soldier but a boy, no older than 16, his features slack in death, his eyes wide as if still surprised by what had happened. The sight tore through her like nothing else had. She froze, the rifle slipping from her hands, her chest constricting as nausea rose in her throat. Around her, the battle raged on, but all she could see was the boy lying still in the mud, his fingers twitching faintly before going still. Her comrades pulled her back, shouting for her to move, but their voices were distant, muffled, like echoes underwater. She stumbled blindly, her vision clouded, her mind spiraling into silence. For the first time she questioned everything, the war, her role in it, the legend she had unwillingly become. Was this what it meant to save lives? Was this what it cost? The hill was taken by nightfall, but at a price so steep it left victory hollow. Hundreds lay dead, the slopes littered with the fallen. The survivors staggered into the captured trenches, too weary even to cheer. Lena sat among them, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her eyes fixed on the dirt. No one spoke to her, though many glanced her way with gratitude, with awe. They believed she had saved them again, that her rifle had once more turned the tide. But she did not feel like a savior. She felt like a shadow of herself, hollowed out, her heart heavy with the weight of the boy's lifeless eyes. That night, as the fires burned low and the wounded moaned in their sleep, she walked alone to the edge of the hill. The valley stretched below, quiet now, stars glimmering coldly above. She gripped the rifle in her hands, staring at it as though it were a stranger. She wanted to hurl it into the darkness, to rid herself of its weight forever. But she could not. She thought of the men who still depended on her, the ones who might yet live because of her aim. And so she lowered the weapon slowly, her chest tight, tears cutting silent paths down her cheeks. In that moment, she understood the truth that had been creeping toward her all along. She was no longer the woman who had once dreamed of nothing more than healing. The war had made her something else entirely, something she did not recognize and did not want to be, yet could not deny. She whispered into the night, her voice breaking, "I don't know who I am anymore." The stars offered no answer, only their cold, eternal silence, and she knew she would carry that silence with her for the rest of her days. The days after the capture of the hill were some of the darkest Lena had endured. The division held the position, but at such a terrible cost that no one could look upon it without feeling the weight of ghosts pressing in from every side. The trenches stank of blood and smoke, the air heavy with the silence of men who had once filled it with laughter or complaints. Lena worked tirelessly, tending to those who could be saved, closing the eyes of those who could not. Yet even in the moments when her hands were steady, her mind returned again and again to the boy's face, to the way his helmet had rolled away, to the lifeless surprise frozen in his eyes. She forced herself to move, to keep breathing, to keep healing, because if she stopped, she feared she would collapse and never rise again. But the war never allowed space for grief. Orders came swiftly, demanding that the division hold against inevitable counterattacks. The enemy could not afford to lose the valley, and they would throw everything they had to reclaim it. The men dug deeper into the hill, fortifying positions, setting up makeshift defenses with whatever scraps of wood or steel they could find. Lena moved among them, delivering what little comfort she could, an extra bandage, a word of reassurance, sometimes only her silent presence. And though her heart was heavier than ever, she saw in their eyes that her presence still mattered. To them, she was a living promise that they were not abandoned, that someone would fight for them when they no longer could. It was 2 nights later when the storm finally came. The enemy advanced under cover of darkness, their artillery roaring to life and turning the night sky into a blaze of fire. Shells rained down, shaking the very earth, collapsing trenches and tearing apart defenses. The soldiers clung to their positions, their rifles trembling, the weight of exhaustion pressing on them like chains. Lena was in the forward trench, crouched low as dirt and debris rained down around her. She knew what was coming. This was not a probing attack, not a skirmish. This was an attempt to annihilate them completely. As the enemy surged forward, wave after wave, chaos consumed the hill. Gunfire cracked in the darkness, shouts and screams rose into the smoke-filled air, and the wounded piled up faster than anyone could move them. Lena worked blindly at first, dragging men to cover, pressing hands against wounds, whispering words of comfort into ears already fading. But soon the line began to buckle. The enemy pressed harder, pouring into the trenches, their bayonets flashing in the firelight. Soldiers fought hand to hand, the ground slick with mud and blood. And in that moment, Lena knew it would not be enough to simply heal. If she did not act, they would all be overrun. She seized her rifle, the weapon that had become both her curse and her salvation, and climbed up onto the rim of the trench. The world erupted into clarity. She saw the officers at the rear, shouting orders, waving their men forward. She saw machine gunners setting up their weapons on the ridges, preparing to cut down every defender still standing. She steadied her breath, her hands firm despite the chaos, and began to fire. One shot, then another and another. Each bullet struck with precision, tearing holes in the enemy's momentum, buying precious seconds for her comrades below. The men saw her, standing against the night with the firelight gleaming on her uniform, her rifle cracking again and again. Their despair lifted, replaced by a surge of defiance. They shouted, rallied, fought harder, their spirits renewed by the sight of the nurse who had once only bound their wounds now holding the line with unshakable resolve. And as the minutes dragged into an hour, as the enemy pressed harder still, Lena refused to falter. Her arms ached, her vision blurred, her ears rang from the endless roar, but she kept firing, each shot deliberate, each shot a promise that they would not be abandoned. Then it happened, the moment that would define everything. Through the smoke and chaos, Lena spotted a cluster of enemy soldiers creeping through a collapsed section of the trench, moving silently toward the rear where more than 50 wounded lay helpless. If they broke through there, it would be a massacre. She knew instantly that this was the choice, the moment where all she had endured had led. She dropped to one knee, steadied her breath and fired. The first fell, then the second, then the third. She shifted, firing again and again, cutting them down before they could reach the helpless men behind her. Every bullet struck true, her aim unshaken despite the storm raging around her. By the time the last of the infiltrators fell, her rifle was hot in her hands, her shoulder bruised from the recoil, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she had done it. The wounded remained untouched, their lives preserved by the barrier of her resolve. 50 men who would have died in the mud now lived because she had acted, because she had refused to let the darkness swallow them. Her comrades realized what had happened, their eyes wide as they looked to her. In their faces she saw gratitude so profound it hurt to meet their gaze. Some whispered her name, others simply stared in silence, but all knew the truth. One shot and then another had saved them all. The battle raged on until dawn, the enemy finally breaking under the unrelenting defense. When the last gunfire faded and silence settled over the hill, the survivors stood together among the ruins, too weary even to cheer. Lena sank down against the trench wall, her rifle resting across her knees, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had no words, no triumph in her heart, only the crushing weight of everything she had done and everything she had lost. Yet as she looked at the men who had lived, at the wounded still breathing behind her, she knew that it had been worth it. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Soldiers whispered of the nurse who had stood against an entire assault, who had saved 50 lives with her rifle when all hope seemed lost. Some called her an angel, others a phantom, but to the men she had saved, she was simply Lena, the woman who had refused to let them die. Her name would never appear in official reports, her deeds buried beneath the cold language of military records, but in the hearts of those who lived, her memory burned brighter than any medal could. Lena herself felt no pride, only exhaustion. She returned to her duties quietly, binding wounds, soothing pain, her hands moving with the same steady gentleness they always had. But inside, she carried the weight of that night, the knowledge that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had saved lives, yes, but at the cost of pieces of herself that she would never recover. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The girl who had once dreamed of nothing more than helping others was gone, replaced by someone forged in fire and blood. Yet even as the war dragged on, Lena held on to one truth. She had not chosen this path, but when the moment came, she had not turned away. She had faced the darkness and refused to let it win. And though history might never remember her name, though the world might move on without ever knowing what she had done, those 50 men would carry her memory with them for the rest of their lives. In that she found her solace. Not glory, not recognition, but the quiet certainty that when it mattered most, she had not faltered. And so she continued, day after day, a shadow on the battlefield, a healer and a marksman, a woman caught between two worlds. The war would take many more lives before it ended, and she would carry many more scars before she was free. But somewhere in the silence of her heart, amid all the grief and loss, there remained a fragile spark, the knowledge that even in the darkest night, one shot could still change everything. The end.